The champagne flute trembled in Olivia's hand as she stood behind the oak tree, watching her ex-husband Marcus adjust his bow tie for the third time in 30 seconds. The September air carried the scent of jasmine and betrayal, weaving through the manicured gardens of the Rosewood Manor, where white roses climbed trellises like accusations. She shouldn't be here. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was madness, that hiding behind foliage at your ex-husband's wedding to your former therapist was the kind of behavior that landed people in padded rooms or true crime documentaries. But rationality had abandoned Olivia Chen 6 months ago, when she'd walked into Dr. Sarah Whitmore's office for what she thought would be another routine therapy session, only to find Marcus sitting in the leather chair that had held her deepest secrets for 2 years. The same chair where she'd sobbed about feeling disconnected from her husband, where she'd questioned whether she was worthy of love, where she'd slowly rebuilt her shattered self-esteem after years of Marcus's subtle undermining disguised as concern. "You look nervous, darling." Sarah's voice drifted across the garden, honeyed and familiar in a way that made Olivia's stomach clench. The same voice that had guided her through panic attacks, that had validated her feelings, that had somehow convinced her she was paranoid when she'd started suspecting Marcus was having an affair. The irony tasted like copper pennies and broken promises. Marcus straightened his shoulders, transforming from the fidgeting man Olivia had known for 8 years into someone she barely recognized. "Just want everything to be perfect for us," he replied, and Olivia noticed how his voice had changed too. Deeper, more confident, the voice of a man who had finally gotten everything he wanted. The wedding photographer, a thin woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, circled the couple like a vulture in designer clothing. "Beautiful light today," she called out, her camera clicking rapidly. "The golden hour is perfect for capturing true love." True love. Olivia's laugh caught in her throat, threatening to escape as a sob. She pressed her back against the rough bark of the oak tree, feeling the ridges through her black dress, the one she'd worn to her mother's funeral, the only appropriately somber outfit in her closet that seemed fitting for watching your life get buried. The gardens bustled with activity as vendors made final preparations. A florist in muddy boots arranged white peonies and eucalyptus along the altar, the same flowers Olivia had carried at her own wedding to Marcus 5 years ago. The caterers rushed between the kitchen and the reception area, their faces flushed with the particular stress that came from serving people who expected perfection and had the money to demand it. "Olivia?" A voice behind her made her jump, nearly dropping the champagne she'd stolen from the catering table. She turned to find David, Marcus's younger brother, staring at her with a mixture of concern and disbelief. His dark hair was shorter than she remembered, and he wore a charcoal gray suit that made his brown eyes look almost black in the dappled sunlight. "David?" She tried to sound casual, as if standing behind a tree at her ex-husband's wedding was perfectly normal behavior. "You look nice." He glanced around nervously, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "What are you doing here? Marcus doesn't know you're—" "No, and he doesn't need to." Olivia straightened her shoulders, trying to summon some dignity. "I'm not here to cause trouble." "Then why are you here?" David's question was gentle but insistent. He'd always been the kind one in the family. The brotherhood actually listened during family dinners, while Marcus held court with his latest business triumph or philosophical revelation. "I need to understand. I need to see if this is real or if it's just another one of his experiments," she said quietly, looking back toward the altar where Marcus and Sarah were now posing for more photos, their bodies fitting together with the practiced ease of people who had been intimate while she'd been paying Dr. Whitmore $200 an hour to fix her marriage. David followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "Liv, you know I love my brother, but what he did to you was legal," Olivia finished. "Morally questionable, professionally unethical for her, but legal. No laws against falling in love with your wife's therapist while she's telling him everything you've said in confidence." The bitterness in her voice made David wince. He'd been there during the divorce proceedings, had seen how Marcus's lawyer had somehow obtained details about Olivia's sessions with Dr. Whitmore. Information that painted her as unstable, paranoid, unable to maintain healthy relationships. Information that should have been protected by doctor-patient confidentiality, but had mysteriously found its way into legal documents. "He's not the same person anymore," David said. And there was something in his tone that made Olivia study his face more carefully. "What do you mean?" David hesitated, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "He's different with her. More, I don't know how to explain it. He's like he was when we were kids, before Dad started pushing him to be perfect at everything." Olivia had heard stories about Marcus's father, a successful businessman who'd measured love in achievements and approval in profit margins. Marcus rarely talked about him except to mention his disappointment when David had chosen teaching over corporate law, when their sister Emma had moved to Portland to become a social worker instead of staying in Chicago to join the family real estate empire. "He's happy," David continued, and the words hit Olivia like a physical blow. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but he is. Sarah makes him laugh in a way I haven't seen since we were teenagers." The champagne flute slipped from Olivia's fingers, shattering on the stone pathway with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire garden. Several guests turned to look, and she quickly knelt to gather the pieces, grateful for the excuse to hide her face as tears threatened to spill. "Careful," David said, kneeling beside her and gently taking the larger shards from her hands. "You'll cut yourself." As they cleaned up the broken glass, Olivia found herself studying the wedding guests who were beginning to arrive. She recognized some of them, colleagues from Marcus's architecture firm, neighbors from their old subdivision, friends from the country club they'd belonged to when money wasn't tight, people who had known her as Marcus's wife, who had probably heard his version of their divorce, carefully crafted to cast him as the devoted husband who tried everything to save their marriage while she spiraled into instability. But there were others she didn't recognize, people who seemed to belong to Sarah's world. Professional women in tailored suits, a few couples with the comfortable ease of long marriages, an elderly woman in a wheelchair being pushed by a younger man who shared his angular features. Sarah's family, Olivia realized. The family that probably heard their own version of the story. The brilliant therapist who'd found love with a client's husband after the marriage was already over, who'd helped a man escape an unhealthy relationship. The truth, as always, was messier than either narrative. "I should go," Olivia said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees.
"Probably," David agreed, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket, turning it over in his hands. "I wasn't sure if I should give this to them." Olivia looked at the package, recognition dawning. The wrapping paper was silver with tiny white doves, the same paper she'd used for wedding gifts when she and Marcus were married. "What is it?" "Something of yours, from the house. Marcus was going to throw it away, but I thought—" He shrugged helplessly. "I thought maybe you'd want it back." She took the package with trembling hands, feeling the weight of something small and hard inside. Her wedding ring, she realized. The simple platinum band that had lived in Marcus's sock drawer after she'd thrown it at him during their final fight. The ring that had symbolized promises they'd both broken in different ways. The sound of string music drifted from the ceremony area as the quartet began their prelude. Guests were taking their seats, and Olivia could see Marcus speaking earnestly with the officiant, a round man in white robes who kept nodding and smiling. "He hired Reverend Campbell," David said, following her gaze. "The same minister who married your parents." The irony wasn't lost on her. Reverend Campbell had officiated her wedding to Marcus, had spoken about the sacred nature of marriage vows, about faithfulness and trust. He'd also been the one to counsel them when their marriage started falling apart, the one who'd recommended Dr. Whitmore when it became clear they needed more help than he could provide. Does he know about how they met? Olivia's silence was answer enough. A commotion near the entrance caught their attention. A black sedan had pulled up to the manor, and a woman in a dark suit was getting out, followed by two men in similar attire. They moved with the purposeful stride of people on official business, and Olivia felt a flutter of recognition. "Who are they?" David whispered. Olivia didn't answer, but her heart had started racing. The woman in the lead was Dr. Patricia Morrison, the head of the State Licensing Board for Mental Health Professionals. Olivia recognized her from the photo that had accompanied the article she'd read 3 months ago about professional boundaries and therapeutic relationships. The article she'd sent to the licensing board along with a formal complaint. The wedding music swelled as Sarah appeared at the back of the garden in a flowing ivory dress, her blonde hair swept into an elegant updo adorned with the same white roses that decorated the altar. She looked radiant, glowing with the kind of happiness that Olivia remembered feeling once, long ago, when she'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings. But Dr. Morrison was walking straight toward the ceremony area, her companions flanking her like bodyguards. Wedding guests were starting to murmur, sensing that something was amiss in their carefully choreographed celebration. Marcus saw them first. Even from her hiding spot behind the oak tree, Olivia could see the moment recognition and panic cross his face. He said something urgent to Reverend Campbell, then started walking quickly toward the approaching officials, intercepting them before they could reach Sarah. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Morrison's voice carried clearly across the garden, trained for courtrooms and professional hearings. "We need to speak with Dr. Sarah Whitmore regarding a formal complaint filed with the State Licensing Board." The string quartet faltered, their music trailing off into awkward silence. Wedding guests turned in their seats, confusion and curiosity rippling through the carefully arranged rows of white chairs. Sarah's face had gone pale, her bouquet trembling in her hands.
"This is our wedding day," Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Surely whatever this is can wait." "I am afraid it cannot, Mr. Chen," Dr. Morrison replied calmly. "The nature of the complaint involves professional misconduct and breach of patient confidentiality. These are serious allegations that require immediate investigation." Olivia felt David's hand close around her wrist, steadying her as her knees threatened to give way. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. The validation she'd needed to prove she wasn't crazy, wasn't paranoid, wasn't the unstable woman Marcus and Sarah had painted her to be. But as she watched Sarah's face crumble, watched Marcus wrap his arms around his bride-to-be in a protective gesture that was achingly familiar, Olivia felt no satisfaction, only a hollow sort of justice that tasted like ashes and regret. The elderly woman in the wheelchair, Sarah's grandmother, Olivia guessed, was being wheeled closer to the commotion by her caregiver, her weathered hands gripping the arms of her chair. "What's happening?" she called out in a voice cracked with age and confusion. "Where's the wedding?" "There isn't going to be a wedding today, Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Morrison said gently. "Your granddaughter needs to come with us to answer some questions about her professional conduct." The package in Olivia's hands seemed to pulse with significance. Her wedding ring, the symbol of promises broken and trust betrayed, wrapped in silver paper with tiny white doves that would never fly. The fluorescent lights of the Starbucks on Maple Avenue hummed with the same persistent drone that had become the soundtrack to Olivia's new life. She sat in her usual corner booth, the one with the worn burgundy cushions and the view of the parking lot, where she could watch people come and go without being part of their stories. The barista, a college student named Riley with purple hair and kind eyes, had stopped asking for her order weeks ago. Large dark roast, no room for cream. No room for hope either, though Riley was too polite to mention that part. It had been 3 days since the wedding that wasn't, and Olivia's phone buzzed constantly with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters, she assumed, though she hadn't answered to confirm. The story had made the local news. Therapist's wedding interrupted by ethics investigation, though they'd been careful not to mention her name. The ex-wife who'd filed the complaint remained anonymous, a footnote in someone else's drama. Her laptop screen glowed with the familiar interface of the freelance writing platform where she'd been scraping together a living since the divorce. Technical writing assignments, blog posts for small businesses, the occasional ghost-written article for executives too busy to form their own thoughts. It wasn't the journalism career she'd dreamed of in college, wasn't the investigative reporting that had made her heart race during her brief stint at the Tribune before budget cuts and Marcus's preference for stability had convinced her to freelance from home. Another day at the office? Riley appeared at her table with a fresh cup, replacing the one that had grown cold while Olivia stared at her computer screen without typing. Something like that. She managed a smile that felt like wearing someone else's clothes. "How's school going?" "Psych 101 is kicking my ass," Riley said, then immediately looked embarrassed. "Sorry. It's challenging. We're studying therapeutic relationships and professional boundaries. Funny how relevant that's become this week." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Riley slid into the seat across from Olivia, taking her mandatory 15-minute break. "Can I ask you something?" Olivia nodded, though every muscle in her body tensed. "How did you know? How did you figure out what was happening? Because in class, they make it sound like these boundary violations are obvious, but they can't be, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't happen so often." The question hit Olivia like cold water. She'd been avoiding this conversation with everyone. Her sister, Emma, who called daily from Portland. Her mother, who'd flown in from Phoenix and was currently reorganizing Olivia's entire apartment as a form of aggressive care, even her own reflection, which she'd been avoiding in mirrors for weeks. "It wasn't obvious," Olivia said finally. "That's what made it so insidious. Sarah was good at what she did. When I started feeling like Marcus was distant, like he was keeping secrets, she helped me process those feelings. She validated my concerns, but also gently suggested that maybe I was being hypersensitive, that my childhood abandonment issues might be making me see threats where there weren't any." Riley leaned forward, her expression intense, with the kind of focus that only came from someone trying to understand the world they were entering. But there had to be signs, right? Olivia thought back to those sessions, the 60-minute hours that had become the anchor of her week. Sarah's office had been decorated in calming blues and greens, with degrees and certifications covering one wall like a fortress of credibility. The couch where Olivia sat was positioned across from Sarah's chair at an angle that felt conversational rather than clinical, and Sarah always kept a box of tissues within reach, as if she expected tears to be part of the process. There were moments, Olivia admitted, times when Sarah would ask very specific questions about Marcus, not just how I felt about things he did, but detailed questions about his schedule, his friends, his work projects. At the time, I thought she was being thorough, helping me understand the full context of our relationship dynamics. But she was gathering intelligence. That's how it looks now. She knew exactly when he'd be home late, knew which work trips were real and which ones were covers for whatever he was doing those nights he said he was having dinner with clients. She knew about his ex-girlfriend reaching out on Facebook before I did, knew about the promotion he was hoping for before he told me himself. Riley whistled softly. "That's so fucked up." "Sorry, that's professionally inappropriate on multiple levels." The casual profanity made Olivia smile genuinely for the first time in days. "It is. But the worst part wasn't the information gathering. It was the way she used what I told her to make me doubt myself. When I said I felt like Marcus was pulling away, she'd ask if I'd been giving him enough space. When I said I suspected he was lying about where he'd been, she'd explore whether my need for control was pushing him away." "Gaslighting," Riley said immediately. "We just covered that. Making someone question their own perceptions and reality. except it was sophisticated gaslighting, wrapped in therapeutic language and delivered by someone I trusted to help me navigate my own mind. Olivia stared out the window, where a young couple was arguing next to a blue Honda, their gestures animated with the kind of passion that suggested they still believed their problems could be solved. The really twisted part, she continued, is that some of what she said was probably true. I do have abandonment issues. My father left when I was 7, and I've spent most of my adult life terrified that everyone I love will eventually decide I'm not worth staying for. Marcus knew that about me, and apparently he shared that information with Sarah, who then used it as a weapon, disguised as healing. Riley's phone buzzed with a text, probably her manager wondering where she was, but she ignored it. How long did this go on? 2 years. 2 years of weekly sessions where I paid someone $200 an hour to systematically dismantle my ability to trust my own judgment. Olivia laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. The funny thing is, I was getting better in some ways. I was more confident at work, started taking on bigger writing assignments, even pitched a story to Chicago Magazine that got accepted. But my marriage was falling apart, and I couldn't understand why my personal growth wasn't translating into a stronger relationship with my husband.
Because he was falling in love with your therapist. Because he was falling in love with someone who knew all my vulnerabilities and exactly how to help him exploit them. The words tasted bitter, but saying them out loud felt necessary, like lancing an infection. Riley glanced at her phone again, then back at Olivia. I have to get back to work, but can I ask one more thing? What made you finally realize what was happening? Olivia had been dreading this question, but she owed Riley honesty after the girl had listened without judgment. It was something small, stupid, really. I came home early from a writing assignment and found Marcus on the phone in his study, door closed, speaking in the voice he used to use when we were dating. Soft, intimate, like he was talking to someone he loved. When I knocked on the door, he ended the call quickly and said it was work. But you didn't believe him. I wanted to. God, I wanted to believe him. But something in my gut, the same instinct Sarah had been teaching me to ignore, told me to pay attention. So I did something I'd never done before. I checked our phone records online. The memory of that evening still made me feel sick with shame and vindication in equal measure. I'd sat at their kitchen table with the laptop, her hands shaking as she scrolled through months of call logs, looking for patterns she hoped she wouldn't find. Sarah's number appeared on there more than mine did. Calls that lasted hours, made after business hours, on weekends, sometimes late at night. And when I cross-referenced the dates with my appointment calendar, I realized he was calling her on the days between my sessions. They were talking about me, about our marriage, about things I'd said in confidence, more than Marcus and I were talking to each other. Riley's expression had shifted from curiosity to something that looked like anger. That's not just unethical, it's evil. I know it sounds dramatic, but I can't think of another word for it. Taking someone who's already struggling with trust issues and systematically destroying their ability to trust themselves while stealing their husband, that's not just professional misconduct, that's psychological warfare. The barista behind the counter was calling Riley's name with increasing urgency, but the girl seemed reluctant to leave. What did you do when you found out? I confronted Marcus first, showed him the phone records, asked him to explain. He told me I was being paranoid, that he'd been calling Sarah to get advice about how to help me, that he was worried about my mental health, and thought having a professional perspective would make him a better husband. Olivia rubbed her temples, feeling the ghost of the headache that had plagued her for weeks after that conversation. It sounded so reasonable when he said it, so caring. I almost believed him. But I'd learned enough about therapeutic boundaries in my journalism courses that therapists don't take calls from their patients' spouses without the patient's knowledge and consent. So I asked Sarah about it in our next session, told her I discovered that Marcus had been calling her, and asked if she thought that was appropriate. The memory of Sarah's face in that moment still gave Olivia a savage satisfaction. The way the professional mask had slipped for just a second, revealing something calculating and cold underneath. She said Marcus had reached out because he was concerned about me, that she'd been trying to help him understand how to support my therapeutic process.
She made it sound like I should be grateful that my husband cared enough to seek professional guidance. But she couldn't meet my eyes when she said it, and I finally knew I wasn't crazy. Riley's manager appearing at their table, arms crossed and expression stern. "Break time's over, Riley. We've got a line." "I'm sorry," Riley said, standing reluctantly, "but thank you for telling me. I mean it. The stuff they teach us in textbooks, it seems so clear-cut, but hearing what it actually looks like in real life? It's messier," Olivia agreed, "and more devastating than any textbook can convey." After Riley left, Olivia sat alone with her cooling coffee and the weight of memories she'd been carrying like stones in her chest. The laptop screen had gone dark, her writing assignments abandoned for another day, while she excavated the ruins of her former life. Her phone buzzed with another unknown number, another reporter probably, but when she glanced at the screen, she saw a text from David. "Are you okay? I know this week has been insane." She stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "I'm surviving. How is Marcus?" "Angry, scared, blaming you for ruining the best thing that ever happened to him." Of course he was. In Marcus's narrative, Olivia was the vengeful ex-wife who couldn't accept that he'd found happiness. He probably genuinely believed that version of events, had convinced himself that what he and Sarah shared was pure love that had simply emerged from tragedy, like flowers growing through concrete. But David's next message made her hands tremble. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. What they did to you was wrong, and someone needed to hold them accountable." Olivia closed her eyes, feeling tears threaten for the first time in days. She'd been so focused on the mechanics of revenge, filing complaints, gathering evidence, constructing an airtight case for professional misconduct, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply acknowledge that she'd been wronged. Her mother appeared at the coffee shop door, scanning the interior until she spotted Olivia in her corner booth. Margaret Chen moved through the world with the determined efficiency of someone who'd raised 2 children as a single parent after her husband's midlife crisis had taken him to California with his secretary. She'd flown in from Phoenix the day after the wedding story broke, armed with Chinese takeout containers and the kind of fierce maternal protectiveness that had gotten Olivia through her father's abandonment 25 years earlier. "There you are," Margaret said, sliding into Riley's vacant seat. "I've been reorganizing your kitchen cabinets. Did you know you have 7 different kinds of tea but no actual tea bags?" "They're loose leaf," Olivia said weakly. "They're pretentious," Margaret corrected, "like everything else in that apartment Marcus convinced you to buy. Overpriced furniture that's uncomfortable to sit on, art that looks like someone sneezed paint on canvas, kitchen gadgets that require engineering degrees to operate." Her mother's criticism of Marcus had become more vocal since the divorce, as if she'd been holding back years of diplomatic silence that could finally be released. Olivia had initially found it comforting, but now it felt like salt in wounds that were trying to heal. "Mom, please, I can't rehash everything wrong with my marriage today." Margaret's expression softened. "I'm not trying to hurt you, sweetheart. I'm trying to help you see that losing Marcus isn't the tragedy you think it is. That man spent 8 years making you smaller, quieter, more convenient. The daughter I raised was bold enough to hitchhike across Europe alone, confident enough to interview senators and CEOs, brave enough to call out corruption wherever she found it. What happened to that girl?" The question hit harder than any of Riley's gentle inquiries. Olivia had been asking herself the same thing for months, wondering when she'd stop trusting her instincts, when she'd started seeking permission for her own thoughts. "She got tired," Olivia said finally. "She got tired of fighting to be heard in her own marriage, tired of being told her career ambitions were selfish, tired of feeling like she had to choose between love and authenticity." And now? Olivia looked around the coffee shop, at the college students hunched over laptops, the business people grabbing caffeine fixes between meetings, the elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner while his wife worked on a crossword puzzle. Normal people living normal lives, uncomplicated by betrayal and professional misconduct, and the kind of psychological manipulation that left scars you couldn't see. "Now I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to save a relationship that was designed to fail," she said. "I'm trying to remember what it feels like to trust my own judgment, to speak up when something feels wrong, to take up space in the world without apologizing for it." Margaret reached across the table and covered Olivia's hand with both of hers. That sounds like the daughter I remember. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the world continue its routine outside the coffee shop windows. Then Olivia's phone rang. Not a text this time, but an actual call from a number she recognized. "It's my editor at Chicago Magazine," she told her mother, then answered. "Hi, Janet." "Olivia! I've been trying to reach you for days. Have you seen the news about the therapist whose wedding got interrupted by the ethics board?" Olivia's stomach clenched. "I saw something about it." "Well, I want you to write about it. Not just the surface story, but the deeper issues. Professional boundaries, abuse of power, and therapeutic relationships. How patients can protect themselves from predatory practitioners. You've got experience with mental health coverage, and this story is going to have legs." The irony was so profound that Olivia almost laughed. Janet wanted her to write about her own experience, to investigate her own trauma, without knowing she was asking the victim to become the reporter. "I don't know, Janet. It seems like there might be ethical issues with that kind of coverage. What if the people involved don't want media attention?" "Since when do you worry about people not wanting media attention?" "Look, this is a story that needs to be told. How many other people are out there right now, sitting in therapists' offices, getting manipulated by someone they trust to help them? How many marriages are being destroyed by practitioners who put their own desires ahead of their professional obligations?" Margaret was watching Olivia's face intently, recognizing the shift in her daughter's expression from defeat to something that looked almost like hunger. "You want me to do an investigation?" Olivia said slowly. "I want you to do what you do best. Dig deep, find the patterns, hold people accountable. This could be a cover story, Olivia, the kind of piece that wins awards and changes regulations." After she hung up, Olivia stared at her laptop screen where her abandoned freelance assignments waited like patient servants. Technical writing about software updates and blog posts about marketing strategies. Safe work that paid the bills, but fed nothing deeper. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked. "I'm thinking," Olivia opened a new document and typed, "Professional boundaries when therapists become predators," at the top of the page, "that maybe it's time to stop being the victim and start being the journalist again." The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation occupied a gray, concrete building that seemed designed to crush hope before visitors even reached the front door. Olivia sat in the sterile waiting room, surrounded by mint green walls and motivational posters that felt like insults, like "Hang in there" featured a kitten dangling from a tree branch, apparently unaware that some problems couldn't be solved with persistence alone. Dr. Patricia Morrison had agreed to meet with her off the record, a professional courtesy extended to journalists working on stories about regulatory oversight. "Miss Chen?" A woman in her 50s appeared in the doorway, her silver hair pulled into the same severe bun Olivia remembered from the interrupted wedding. Dr. Morrison moved with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd spent decades navigating bureaucracy and broken systems. "Thank you for coming in." Her office was as institutional as the waiting room, with metal filing cabinets and fluorescent writing that made everyone look slightly ill. But the walls were covered with certificates and commendations that spoke to a career dedicated to protecting vulnerable people from exactly the kind of abuse Olivia had experienced. "I want to be clear about the ground rules," Dr. Morrison said, settling behind her desk. "I can speak to you about general issues related to therapeutic boundaries and professional misconduct. I cannot discuss specific cases or ongoing investigations." "I understand." Olivia pulled out her digital recorder, noting how Dr. Morrison's expression tightened slightly. "How common are these types of boundary violations?" "More common than most people realize, less common than the media sometimes suggests." Dr. Morrison's answer had the practiced cadence of someone who'd given similar interviews many times. "The vast majority of mental health professionals maintain appropriate boundaries with their patients. But when violations occur, the impact on victims can be devastating and long-lasting." Olivia had been researching for 3 weeks, diving into academic journals and case studies, building a framework for understanding her own experience within larger patterns of abuse. The numbers were sobering.
Studies suggested that between 4–12% of therapists engaged in some form of boundary violation with patients, ranging from inappropriate personal disclosure to sexual relationships. But the real damage wasn't captured in statistics. It was in the stories of people whose ability to trust, to seek help, to believe in their own perceptions had been systematically destroyed. What makes these cases particularly harmful, Dr. Morrison continued, is the power dynamic involved. Patients seek therapy when they're vulnerable, when they're struggling with depression, anxiety, relationship problems, trauma. They're explicitly told to trust their therapist with their deepest secrets and fears. When that trust is exploited, it doesn't just damage the therapeutic relationship, it damages the person's ability to trust anyone, including themselves. The words hit Olivia like physical blows, each one confirming what she'd been too afraid to articulate. What about cases where the therapist targets a patient's spouse, where the boundary violation involves not just betraying the patient's trust, but actively undermining their marriage? Dr. Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying Olivia with shrewd eyes. That's a particularly sophisticated form of abuse. It requires the therapist to maintain their professional facade with the patient while simultaneously developing an inappropriate relationship with someone in the patient's life. The level of manipulation involved is extraordinary. How would someone prove that kind of manipulation occurred? Phone records, emails, testimony from witnesses. But the challenge is that much of the damage is psychological. How do you prove that someone used confidential information to sabotage a marriage? How do you demonstrate that a therapist deliberately undermined a patient's mental health for personal gain? Dr. Morrison's expression had grown grim. These are complex cases that require extensive investigation. Olivia's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Dinner at 6. Made your favorite chicken and dumplings." The normalcy of it felt surreal in the context of her current conversation. What happens to practitioners who are found guilty of these violations? License suspension or revocation, depending on the severity. Civil lawsuits are also possible, though they're difficult to win because the damages are primarily emotional rather than financial. She paused. The real tragedy is that many victims never report these crimes because they blame themselves, or because they're afraid no one will believe them.
After leaving the regulatory office, Olivia drove to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where Dr. James Fletcher, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating victims of therapeutic abuse, had agreed to speak with her. The hospital's psychiatry wing felt different from the sterile government building, warmer, more human, designed for healing rather than punishment. Dr. Fletcher was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of calm presence that probably made broken people feel safe. His office overlooked the Chicago River, and Olivia found herself watching boats navigate the water while he explained the long-term psychological impact of therapeutic betrayal. "The patients I treat often describe feeling like they're living in two realities," he said, settling into a chair across from her rather than behind his desk. "There's the reality where they were victimized by someone they trusted, and there's the reality they were taught to believe, that they're unstable, paranoid, responsible for the relationship's failure." How do you help them reconcile those competing narratives? Very slowly, very carefully. The first step is usually helping them understand that their instincts were correct, that they weren't imagining the manipulation. But that's often the hardest part because these victims have been systematically taught to doubt their own perceptions. Olivia thought about her months of self-doubt, the sleepless nights when she'd wondered if her suspicions about Marcus were symptoms of deeper psychological problems. What about anger? Is it normal for victims to feel rage toward both the therapist and their former partner? Dr. Fletcher smiled sadly. Anger is not only normal, it's necessary. These victims have often spent years suppressing their anger, being told that their emotional responses were inappropriate or excessive. Learning to feel anger again, to trust that emotion is valid information, is actually a crucial part of healing. But what if the anger becomes consuming? What if someone can't move past the desire for revenge? That's where professional help becomes essential. The goal isn't to eliminate anger, but to channel it constructively.
Some of my patients become advocates for other victims, some pursue legal action, some focus on rebuilding their ability to trust and form healthy relationships. The key is transforming the anger from a destructive force into fuel for positive change. Olivia left the hospital with pages of notes and a growing sense that her story was bigger than personal revenge. She was documenting a pattern of abuse that was largely invisible to the public, a crime that happened in therapy offices behind closed doors where no one could witness the systematic dismantling of a person's psychological foundation. Her next stop was the law offices of Harrison, Caldwell, and Associates, where attorney Michael Reeves specialized in malpractice cases against mental health professionals. His office was everything Dr. Fletcher's wasn't: sleek, expensive, designed to intimidate opposing counsel rather than comfort traumatized patients. "These cases are challenging," Reeves said bluntly, not bothering with pleasantries after Olivia explained her research. "Proving malpractice requires demonstrating that the therapist violated standard care practices and that this violation directly caused harm to the patient. When the violation involves personal relationships rather than sexual misconduct, the lines become blurred." What about breach of confidentiality? If a therapist shares patient information with a third party without consent? That's more straightforward, but you still need documentation. Phone records, emails, witnesses who can testify about conversations that included confidential information. Reeves leaned forward, studying Olivia intently. "You're not just researching this story, are you? You're building a case." The accusation hung in the air between them. Olivia had told herself she was being objective, journalistic. But sitting in this expensive office surrounded by law books and certificates of legal victory, she couldn't deny the truth. She wasn't just writing about therapeutic abuse, she was systematically documenting her own case for potential legal action.
What would someone need to prove a case like this? She asked. Evidence of inappropriate contact between the therapist and a third party, documentation that confidential patient information was shared without consent, testimony from witnesses about the timing of the relationship versus the therapeutic relationship, financial records showing damages, lost income due to psychological distress, cost of additional therapy, medical expenses for depression or anxiety treatment. Olivia thought about her own carefully maintained documentation, bank records showing decreased freelance income during her worst months, receipts from Dr. Fletcher's sessions, the phone records that had first revealed the extent of Marcus and Sarah's communication. She'd been building a legal case without realizing it, her journalist's instincts automatically preserving evidence. "The challenge," Reeves continued, "is that juries often blame the victims in these cases. They can't understand how someone could be manipulated by their therapist, especially if the victim is educated and successful. They expect people to recognize abuse when it's happening. But that's exactly what makes this type of abuse so effective. The victim is told their perceptions are symptoms of mental illness." Exactly, which is why these cases require expert testimony from other mental health professionals who can explain the dynamics of therapeutic manipulation to a jury. Reeves paused. "If you know someone who might want to pursue legal action, tell them to document everything. Keep records of all therapy sessions, all communication with the therapist, all financial impacts of the abuse. And find a lawyer who understands the psychology involved, not just the legal technicalities." That evening, Olivia sat in her apartment, surrounded by stacks of research materials, legal documents, and interview transcripts. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming while she prepared dinner, the sound a comforting contrast to the weight of everything Olivia had learned. Her laptop screen showed a half-finished article that was transforming from a simple news story into an investigation that could have real impact on how therapeutic abuse was understood and prosecuted. Her phone rang, interrupting her concentration. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and Olivia felt the familiar mixture of love and guilt that came with talking to her younger sister. "How's the investigating going?" Emma asked without preamble. She was a social worker in Portland, accustomed to dealing with trauma and abuse, but her voice carried the protective anger of a sister who'd watched Olivia suffer. "Complected? The more I learn about this pattern of abuse, the more I realize how sophisticated Sarah's manipulation was.
She didn't just steal my husband, she systematically destroyed my ability to recognize what was happening. That's not your fault, Liv. You trusted someone who was supposed to help you. That's not naivety, it's normal human behavior. I know that intellectually, but emotionally, I keep thinking about all the times I could have spoken up, could have trusted my instincts, could have recognized the red flags. Emma was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something? When Marcus first started calling me about you, asking about your episodes and whether I thought you needed more intensive therapy, I had this weird feeling in my gut, like he was fishing for ammunition rather than genuinely concerned about your welfare. Marcus called you about me. Multiple times. He said you were having panic attacks, that you were becoming paranoid and suspicious, that your therapist was concerned about your mental state. He wanted to know if I'd ever seen similar behavior from you, if there was family history of mental illness he should know about. The betrayal felt fresh and sharp, like a wound being reopened. You never told me. I should have. God, Liv, I should have called you immediately. But Marcus made it sound like you were fragile, like confronting you about it would make things worse. He said your therapist had advised him to gather information from family members to better understand your psychological patterns.
Olivia closed her eyes, seeing the full scope of Sarah's manipulation for the first time. It wasn't just about stealing her husband. It was about isolating her from her support system, creating a narrative of mental instability that would explain away any accusations she might make later. What did you tell him? Nothing useful, I hope. I told him you'd always been sensitive and perceptive, that what he was calling paranoia sounded like you paying attention to things that didn't feel right. I told him that in my experience, women's intuition is usually based on real evidence, even when they can't articulate what they're sensing. Relief flooded through Olivia's chest. Thank you. You have no idea how much I needed to hear that. I'm sorry I didn't trust my instincts at the time. I let Marcus convince me that staying quiet was better for you, but I should have talked to you directly. After they hung up, Olivia called David, her fingers shaking as she dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. Olivia, is everything okay? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did Marcus ever talk to you about my mental health? About sessions with my therapist? David's silence stretched long enough that she knew the answer before he spoke. Yeah, he did. Jesus, Liv. I wondered if I should have said something to you. What did he tell you? That you were struggling with anxiety and depression, that your therapist was helping him understand how to support you through it. He said you were having episodes where you'd become suspicious and paranoid, accusing him of things that weren't true. David paused, but honestly, the way he talked about it never sat right with me. He seemed almost clinical about it, like he was describing a case study rather than talking about his wife. The pattern was becoming clear. Sarah hadn't just manipulated Olivia directly. She'd coached Marcus on how to manipulate Olivia's entire support system, creating a network of people who believed she was mentally unstable. Anyone Olivia might have turned to for support had already been primed to see her accusations as symptoms rather than truth. David, I need you to think carefully. Did Marcus ever mention Sarah's name specifically? Did he ever indicate that he was getting this information directly from her? Not in so many words, but yeah, I think he did. He'd say things like, Sarah thinks, or according to Sarah, when he was explaining your psychological state. At the time, I assumed he was just relaying what you'd told him about your sessions. But therapists don't diagnose patients to their spouses. They don't share clinical observations with family members without the patient's explicit consent. Fuck. The profanities sounded strange from coming from David, who usually maintained careful politeness. You're saying she was feeding him information about your sessions so he could use it against you? I'm saying she was using confidential information to help him gaslight me while simultaneously developing a romantic relationship with him. I'm saying this was a coordinated campaign to destroy my marriage and my mental health.
The conversation ended with David promising to document everything he could remember about his conversations with Marcus, including dates and specific details about what information she had shared.
Was shared. Another piece of evidence for the case Olivia was building without consciously deciding to build it. She spent the rest of the evening organizing her research, creating timelines, and cross-referencing Marcus and Sarah's behavior with expert descriptions of therapeutic abuse. The patterns were undeniable once she laid them out systematically. The gradual erosion of her self-trust, the isolation from her support system, the way every concern she raised was reframed as evidence of her psychological problems. Her mother appeared in the doorway with a cup of tea, surveying the controlled chaos of Olivia's investigation. "You're not just writing an article, are you?" "I don't know what I'm doing," Olivia admitted. "I started out wanting to expose Sarah and Marcus, to prove that I wasn't the crazy ex-wife everyone thinks I am. But the more I research this, the more I realize how many other people are going through the same thing. How many women are sitting in therapists' offices right now, being told that their instincts are symptoms, while someone they trust destroys their lives from the inside out." Margaret sat down on the couch, moving carefully around the stacks of legal documents. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Olivia looked at her laptop screen, at the article that was growing into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple news story. "I'm going to write the truth, all of it, and then I'm going to make sure everyone who needs to see it gets a copy." The next morning brought a call that changed everything. Olivia was reviewing interview transcripts when her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Olivia Chen?" The voice was female, young, nervous. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Jennifer Walsh. I saw the news story about Dr. Whitmore, and I think I need to talk to someone. I think she did the same thing to me." Olivia's hand tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "I was seeing her for couples therapy with my boyfriend, ex-boyfriend now. She convinced me that I was too controlling, too jealous, that my relationship insecurities were destroying our partnership. She said I needed individual therapy to work on my abandonment issues before I could have a healthy relationship with anyone." The familiar pattern made Olivia's stomach clench. "What happened?" "I found out 2 weeks ago that she's been dating Ryan for 6 months. They met during one of our couple sessions, and apparently she's been counseling him about how to handle my emotional instability while they were falling in love." Jennifer's voice broke. "I thought I was going crazy. Everyone told me I was being paranoid, that I should be grateful Ryan cared enough to seek professional help for our relationship problems." Olivia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. Sarah Whitmore was a serial predator, using her professional position to systematically destroy women's lives while stealing their partners, and Olivia might be the only person in a position to stop her. "Jennifer, I'm working on an investigation into Dr. Whitmore's professional conduct. Would you be willing to speak with me about your experience?" "Yes. God, yes. I need someone to believe me. I need someone to tell me I'm not crazy." "You're not crazy," Olivia said, the words carrying the weight of her own hard-won understanding. "What happened to you was real, and it was wrong, and you deserve justice." After scheduling a meeting with Jennifer, Olivia called Michael Reeves' office. If Sarah had multiple victims, if there was a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years, the legal case became much stronger. More importantly, the story became much bigger than personal revenge. It became a public safety issue that could protect other women from similar abuse.
The investigation was no longer about Olivia's marriage or her need for vindication. It was about exposing a system that allowed predators to operate with impunity while their victims were dismissed as unstable, jealous, or delusional. It was about giving other women permission to trust their instincts and demand accountability from the professionals they trusted with their deepest vulnerabilities.
As she prepared questions for her interview with Jennifer, Olivia felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose that extended beyond her own pain. She was no longer just the victim of Sarah Whitmore's manipulation. She was the journalist who was going to expose the truth and make sure it never happened to anyone else. The anger was still there, burning bright and clean in her chest, but now it had direction, focus, a constructive outlet that could channel her rage into something that mattered. She was going to write the story that would end Sarah Whitmore's career and protect other women from similar predators. And she was going to enjoy every minute of it. Jennifer Walsh sat across from Olivia in the same corner booth at Starbucks, her hands wrapped around a large coffee cup as if it were an anchor in turbulent water. She was younger than Olivia had expected, maybe 26, with auburn hair pulled into a messy bun and dark circles under her green eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and shattered trust. Her story unfolded with the halting cadence of someone who'd been told her reality was fiction for so long that speaking truth felt dangerous. Ryan and I had been together for 3 years when we started seeing Dr. Whitmore, Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. We were having the usual problems couples have: communication issues, different ideas about money, disagreements about whether to move in together. Nothing that seemed insurmountable, but Ryan thought professional help would be good for us. Olivia took careful notes, recognizing the familiar setup: the reasonable boyfriend suggesting therapy, the problems that seemed manageable but somehow kept escalating, the professional who was supposed to help but instead began systematically dismantling the relationship from within. At first, the sessions felt helpful. Dr. Whitmore was so understanding, so insightful about our dynamics. She helped us see patterns in our arguments, taught us communication techniques, made us both feel heard and validated. When did things start to change? Jennifer stared into her coffee cup as if the answer might be floating there among the foam. Maybe 2 months in? She started focusing more on what she called my attachment style. She said I showed signs of anxious attachment, that I was bringing abandonment fears from childhood into the relationship and creating problems that didn't really exist. The words hit Olivia like déjà vu made manifest. Sarah had used almost identical language in their sessions, the same clinical terminology that made personal criticisms sound like professional observations. She said Ryan was naturally more independent, that he needed space to feel secure in the relationship, but that my need for reassurance was making him feel trapped. Jennifer's laugh was better. Looking back, I can see how she was already positioning herself as the understanding woman who could give him what I couldn't. Did she see you individually as well as for couples therapy? That was her suggestion. She said my attachment issues were too complex to address fully in couple sessions, that I needed individual work to understand why I was so threatened by his friendships and outside activities. Jennifer finally looked up from her coffee, meeting Olivia's eyes. The thing is, I wasn't threatened by his friendships. I was threatened by his secrecy, by the way he'd become evasive about where he was spending his time, by the feeling that he was pulling away from me emotionally. Olivia felt the familiar chill of recognition. But she convinced you that those feelings were symptoms rather than observations. Exactly. She had this way of making me question everything I thought I knew about myself, about my relationship, about my own perceptions.
About how much time he was spending with his coworkers, she'd explore whether my need to control his social life was rooted in my fear of abandonment. Jennifer pulled out her phone and showed Olivia a series of text messages. I started documenting our conversations because I felt like I was losing my mind. Look at this. This is from a session 3 months ago. The messages were from Jennifer to herself, sent immediately after therapy appointments as a way to preserve her memory of what had actually been discussed. Olivia read through them with growing horror and recognition. Sarah said my jealousy about Ryan's new female colleague is projection of my own insecurities and that secure partners don't need constant reassurance about fidelity. She suggested I practice giving Ryan space without asking where he's going or when he'll be back. Sarah thinks my need to know details about Ryan's day is control masquerading as intimacy, and that Ryan might be pulling away because he feels suffocated by my emotional demands. Sarah explained that my suspicion that Ryan is hiding something from me is catastrophic thinking based on childhood trauma of my father's affair. She said I'm creating the very abandonment I fear by being suspicious and demanding. Each message was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as therapeutic insight. Sarah had taken Jennifer's legitimate concerns about her partner's behavior and systematically reframed them as evidence of Jennifer's psychological dysfunction. When did you find out about their relationship? Jennifer's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. 2 weeks ago. I went to Ryan's apartment to surprise him for his birthday and found her there. They were cooking dinner together, laughing, completely comfortable with each other in a way that was obviously not new. What did they say when they saw you? Ryan looked panicked, but Sarah was calm. She said they needed to talk to me about ending our therapeutic relationship because she and Ryan had developed feelings for each other. She made it sound so professional, so ethical, like she was protecting me from a conflict of interest rather than admitting she'd been fucking my boyfriend while convincing me I was too crazy to deserve him. The clinical language, the professional demeanor maintained even in the moment of ultimate betrayal, it was exactly what Olivia would have expected from Sarah. The woman had turned gaslighting into an art form, maintaining her therapeutic authority even while destroying lives. What did Ryan say? That he'd been confused about his feelings, that Sarah had helped him understand that we weren't compatible, that he'd been trying to figure out how to end things with me without hurting me. Jennifer wiped her eyes with a napkin. He actually thanked her for helping him see that his guilt about wanting to leave me was misplaced, that staying in an unhealthy relationship out of obligation wasn't good for either of us. Olivia felt sick. She convinced him that wanting to cheat was actually a sign of emotional growth. Apparently, she told him that his attraction to her was natural and healthy, that it indicated he was ready for a more mature relationship with someone who didn't need constant validation. The sophistication of the manipulation was breathtaking. Sarah had managed to position herself as the selfless professional helping both partners recognize their incompatibility, when in reality she'd been systematically destroying their relationship while positioning herself as the superior alternative. Have you spoken to anyone else about this? Family, friends, other professionals?
I tried. My system thinks I'm being dramatic, that these things happen and I should focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on blame. My best friend from college said maybe Sarah was right about my attachment style, that I should use this as an opportunity to work on myself. Jennifer's laugh was hollow. Even my new therapist, the one I found to help me process all this, seemed skeptical when I explained what happened. She kept asking if I was sure about the timeline, if maybe Ryan and Sarah's relationship developed after our therapy ended. Olivia recognized the pattern. Sarah's victims were isolated not just by her direct manipulation, but by a system that was predisposed to doubt women who accused mental health professionals of abuse. The victims were already labeled as psychologically unstable. Who would believe their accusations against the very people who were supposed to be helping them? Jennifer, I need to tell you something. You're not the first person Sarah has done this to. I think she's a serial predator who uses her position as a therapist to target vulnerable women and steal their partners. For the first time since she'd started talking, Jennifer looked genuinely surprised. You mean there are others? I know of at least one other case, mine, and based on my research, I suspect there are more victims who haven't come forward yet. Olivia explained her own experience with Sarah, watching Jennifer's expression shift from shock to validation to anger as she realized she wasn't alone.
They compared notes about Sarah's techniques, her language patterns, the way she'd isolated them from their support systems while positioning herself as the only person who truly understood their psychological needs. "We need to stop her," Jennifer said finally. "However many women she's done this to, however many relationships she's destroyed, it has to stop. I'm working on an investigation that should expose her pattern of abuse, but I need documentation. Phone records, emails, therapy notes, anything that can prove she shared confidential information or that her relationships with your partners began while you were still her patients." Jennifer nodded eagerly. "I kept everything. All my therapy notes, all my texts to myself after sessions, bank records showing payments to her practice, and I think I can get phone records showing when Ryan first contacted her outside of our scheduled appointments." They spent the next 2 hours going through Jennifer's documentation, building a timeline that showed clear evidence of professional misconduct. The pattern was unmistakable once laid out systematically. The gradual erosion of Jennifer's self-confidence, the increasing focus on her psychological problems, the coaching Ryan received about managing her emotional instability, and the development of an intimate relationship between Sarah and Ryan that coincided perfectly with the deterioration of Jennifer and Ryan's partnership. "There's something else," Jennifer said as they prepared to leave. "Ryan mentioned that Sarah had other patients dealing with similar relationship problems. He said she had told him that women with attachment disorders often ended up in patterns where they drove away partners who were trying to love them." Olivia felt a chill of recognition. "Did he mention any specifics? Names? Situations?" "Not names, but he said Sarah had mentioned a case where she'd had to refer a patient to another therapist because the woman's husband had asked for guidance about supporting her wife through therapy, and the professional boundaries had become complicated." The implication was clear. Sarah had been discussing Olivia's case with Jennifer's boyfriend, using one victim's story to normalize her behavior with another. The violation of confidentiality was staggering, but more than that, it suggested a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years. That evening, Olivia sat in her apartment with Jennifer's evidence spread across her dining table alongside her own documentation. Her mother was in the kitchen again this time, making soup and occasionally glancing over at the growing pile of legal documents with an expression of grim satisfaction.
"You're building quite a case," Margaret said, bringing Olivia a bowl of chicken noodle soup that smelled like childhood and comfort. "We're building a case," Olivia corrected. "Jennifer, me, probably other women we haven't found yet. This isn't about personal revenge anymore. It's about protecting other people from a predator who's been operating with impunity for years." Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Dr. Patricia Morrison's number. "Miss Chen, I hope you don't mind me calling after hours, but we've had some developments in the Whitmore case that I thought you should know about." Olivia's pulse quickened. "What kind of developments?" "We've received 3 additional complaints in the past week, all following similar patterns to the one you filed. Therapists engaging in inappropriate relationships with patient spouses or partners, confidentiality breaches, professional misconduct designed to undermine patients' relationships. 3 more women. 3 more lives systematically destroyed by someone they'd trusted to help them heal." Olivia felt the weight of responsibility and opportunity in equal measure. "Are you able to share any details about the other cases?" "Not specifics, but I can tell you that the pattern of behavior is consistent enough to warrant a formal investigation. We'll be interviewing Dr. Whitmore next week, and depending on what we find, we may be looking at license suspension or revocation." After she hung up, Olivia called Michael Reeves to update him on the new developments. The attorney's response was immediate and decisive. "With multiple victims showing the same pattern of abuse, we have the foundation for a strong civil case. More importantly, we have evidence of systematic professional misconduct that goes beyond individual boundary violations." "What does that mean practically?"
It means Sarah Whitmore isn't just going to lose her license, she's going to face significant financial consequences. And more importantly, it means other mental health professionals will take notice. This kind of case changes industry practices. Olivia spent the rest of the evening updating her article, transforming it from a personal story into an investigation of systematic abuse within the mental health system. She reached out to Dr. Fletcher for additional expert commentary, contacted the other victims through Dr. Morrison's office to request interviews, and began crafting a narrative that would expose not just Sarah's crimes, but the systemic failures that had allowed them to continue unchecked. The next morning brought a call from Janet at Chicago Magazine. "Olivia, I don't know what kind of story you're working on, but I just got a call from a lawyer threatening legal action if we publish anything about Dr. Sarah Whitmore without concrete evidence of wrongdoing." Olivia's blood ran cold. What kind of lawyer? Criminal defense, high-end firm downtown. They're claiming their client is the victim of a harassment campaign by disgruntled former patients who are trying to destroy her reputation and career. The move was predictable but still infuriating. Sarah was using her resources to intimidate potential critics into silence, relying on the same power dynamics that had allowed her abuse to continue for years. But Olivia had spent weeks building an airtight case, documenting every allegation with evidence that would stand up in court. "Janet, I have documentation, phone records, emails, testimony from multiple victims, expert analysis from other mental health professionals. This isn't a harassment campaign. It's investigative journalism exposing a pattern of criminal behavior." "I hope so, because our legal department is nervous about taking on a licensed professional without ironclad evidence. You're going to need to make this bulletproof."
The truth. Sarah Whitmore destroyed my life for her own entertainment, and I'm not going to let her get away with it just because she has expensive lawyers. That afternoon, Olivia received an unexpected visitor. David appeared at her apartment door, carrying coffee and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "About Marcus, about Sarah, about everything that happened." They sat in her living room, surrounded by the evidence of her investigation, while David struggled to find words for what he'd come to say. "I've been thinking about everything you told me. About the way Marcus talked about your mental health, about the information Sarah was feeding him." He paused, running his hands through his hair. "There's something I never told you. Something I should have said months ago." Olivia felt her stomach clench with anticipation. "The night before Marcus asked you for a divorce, he called me. He was drunk, rambling about how Sarah had helped him see that he'd been enabling your psychological problems by staying in an unhealthy marriage. He said she'd shown him research about codependent relationships, about how sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is remove yourself from their life so they can get the help they really need." The clinical language, even filtered through Marcus's alcohol-loosened tongue, was unmistakably Sarah's. She'd coached him, not just on how to leave, but on how to frame his abandonment as an act of therapeutic intervention. "But here's the thing," David continued. "In the middle of all this psychological analysis, Marcus said something that didn't fit. He said Sarah understood him in a way no one ever had, that she saw potential in him that you'd never recognized. He said she made him feel like the man he was meant to be." The implication was clear. Sarah hadn't just been providing professional consultation about Olivia's mental health, she'd been seducing Marcus with validation and admiration, making him feel special and understood in deliberate contrast to how she'd coached him to see his marriage. "There's more," David said reluctantly.
He mentioned that Sarah had told him about other patients she'd helped extract from unhealthy relationships, women who were grateful later for the intervention, even though they'd been angry at the time. He said you'd probably thank him someday for having the courage to prioritize your mental health over his own comfort. Olivia felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Sarah hadn't just been targeting individual women. She'd been running a systematic operation, identifying vulnerable patients with attractive partners and then methodically destroying their relationships while positioning herself as the superior alternative. The therapeutic framework provided perfect cover, allowing her to pathologize her victims' natural responses to betrayal and manipulation. "Why are you telling me this now?" David met her eyes directly. "Because I know my brother, and the man who made that phone call wasn't the Marcus I grew up with. He was someone else, someone who'd been programmed to see his wife as a psychological problem rather than a human being he'd promised to love. And because I think Sarah Whitmore is dangerous in ways none of us fully understood until now." That evening, Olivia worked on her article until well past midnight, weaving together the testimonies of multiple victims, expert analysis of therapeutic abuse, and documented evidence of Sarah's systematic manipulation. The story was no longer about her failed marriage. It was about a predator who'd weaponized the mental health system against vulnerable women, and about the institutional failures that had allowed her to operate with impunity for years.
She wrote about the isolation tactics Sarah used to cut her victims off from their support systems, about the way she'd coached their partners to see legitimate concerns as symptoms of mental illness, about the sophisticated gaslighting techniques that left women questioning their own sanity. She included expert commentary about the long-term psychological damage caused by therapeutic betrayal, an analysis of the regulatory gaps that allowed such abuse to continue unchecked. But most importantly, she wrote about the other victims, women like Jennifer who'd found the courage to speak out, who documented their experiences and demanded accountability, even when everyone around them suggested they were being dramatic or vindictive. The article ended with a call to action, a list of warning signs for therapeutic abuse, resources for victims seeking help, and information about how to file complaints with state licensing boards. It included contact information for attorneys specializing in mental health malpractice and support groups for people recovering from therapeutic betrayal. As she prepared to submit the final draft to Chicago Magazine, Olivia realized she was no longer writing as Sarah Whitmore's victim. She was writing as a journalist who'd uncovered a pattern of systematic abuse, as an advocate for other women who'd been silenced by shame and self-doubt, as someone who'd transformed her personal trauma into a tool for social change. The anger was still there, burning bright and clean in her chest, but now it had purpose beyond revenge. It had become fuel for justice, for accountability, for ensuring that Sarah Whitmore would never again have the opportunity to destroy another woman's life from the inside out. A true story of therapeutic abuse, investigation, and justice. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals come from those we trust most. This is the story of how one woman's nightmare became a beacon of hope for countless others, a tale of manipulation, courage, and the power of investigative journalism to create lasting change. Olivia Chen thought she was seeking help for her troubled marriage when she began therapy with Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a respected psychologist with an impressive practice in Chicago. What she found instead was a predator who would systematically destroy her life while positioning herself as both therapist and savior. Dr. Whitmore was everything a vulnerable patient might hope for: articulate, empathetic, professionally credentialed, and seemingly dedicated to helping couples work through their difficulties. But beneath the polished exterior lay a calculated manipulator who had perfected the art of therapeutic abuse over years of practice. The manipulation began subtly. During couples therapy sessions with Olivia and her husband Marcus, Dr. Whitmore would make observations that seemed insightful but were actually designed to undermine Olivia's confidence and credibility.
She convinced Marcus that his wife's anxiety were symptoms of mental illness rather than legitimate grievances about his behavior. "Your wife's anxiety is preventing her from seeing the progress you're making," Sarah would tell Marcus during private sessions that Olivia wasn't aware were happening. "She needs individual therapy to address her trust issues, but I'm concerned she's not ready to face her problems." Meanwhile, Sarah was telling Olivia that her husband was making remarkable progress and that her inability to see his improvements was evidence of her own mental problems. The classic gaslighting technique, making the victim question their own perceptions while the abuser maintains control of the narrative. But Sarah's manipulation went far beyond typical therapeutic misconduct. She was using confidential information from Olivia's individual sessions to coach Marcus on how to further destabilize his wife's mental health. Every vulnerability Olivia shared in the supposed safety of the therapy room became a weapon used against her in her marriage. Over months of treatment, Olivia watched her marriage disintegrate, while her therapist assured her that the problem was her inability to trust and her unrealistic expectations. Sarah had convinced Marcus that her wife was mentally unstable while simultaneously positioning herself as the understanding professional who truly comprehended his needs.
The psychological abuse was sophisticated and devastating. Sarah would share just enough of Olivia's confidential disclosures with Marcus to give them ammunition for their arguments, then express concern about Olivia's paranoid thinking when she noticed her private thoughts being reflected in her husband's criticisms. "I think your wife might benefit from medication," Sarah suggested to Marcus during one of their increasingly frequent private consultations. "Her anxiety seems to be escalating, and she's becoming resistant to therapeutic intervention." Meanwhile, Sarah was developing a romantic relationship with Marcus, using her professional insights into his psychology and her intimate knowledge of his marital problems to position herself as the ideal alternative to his difficult wife. She knew exactly what he needed to hear, exactly how to present herself as everything Olivia wasn't. The betrayal was multi-layered and devastating. Not only was Olivia's husband having an affair with her therapist, but the affair had been engineered using confidential information she had shared in pursuit of healing. Her most private struggles had been weaponized against her by the very person she had trusted to help her work through them. The full scope of the betrayal became clear when Olivia discovered Marcus at what she thought was a professional conference, only to realize he was attending Sarah's wedding to another man, a wedding where he was clearly more than just a professional colleague. The elaborate deception collapsed in that moment, revealing the true nature of their relationship and Sarah's systematic manipulation of multiple patients' lives. Hiding behind an oak tree, watching her husband celebrate with the woman who had destroyed their marriage while pretending to help save it, Olivia felt the familiar surge of self-doubt that Sarah had carefully cultivated. Was she really seeing what she thought she was seeing? Was her interpretation of events another symptom of the mental health problems everyone kept telling her she had? But this time, the evidence was undeniable. This time, she trusted her own perceptions despite months of psychological conditioning designed to make her doubt herself. This time, she decided to fight back. What transformed Olivia's personal trauma into a larger story of accountability was her background as a journalist. She possessed the skills necessary to document systematic abuse, the professional credibility to get sources to talk to her, and the determination to expose patterns that might otherwise remain hidden. Her investigation began with a simple question. If Sarah had manipulated her marriage so thoroughly, had she done the same thing to other patients? The answer was yes, and the scope of the abuse was far worse than Olivia had imagined. Working methodically, Olivia identified other women who had been patients of Dr. Whitmore. What she found was a consistent pattern of abuse, spanning 5 years and multiple victims. Sarah had refined her techniques through repeated practice,
targeting vulnerable women in troubled relationships and systematically destroying their marriages while positioning herself or her associates as romantic alternatives to the patient's existing partners. Jennifer was a young woman whose relationship had been sabotaged during couples counseling, with Sarah convincing Jennifer's boyfriend Ryan that his girlfriend's concerns about their relationship were evidence of mental illness. The manipulation had been so thorough that Ryan eventually broke up with Jennifer on Sarah's advice, believing he was protecting his own mental health from her toxic behavior. Amanda had been targeted during grief counseling after her mother's death. Sarah had used her vulnerability and isolation to engineer a relationship between herself and her fiancé, prolonging Amanda's grief process while positioning herself as the understanding professional who could help her fiancé cope with his partner's excessive mourning. Each case followed the same template: identify vulnerable women seeking help, exploit their confidential disclosures to manipulate their romantic relationships, gaslight the victims about their own perceptions, and position themselves or their associates as superior alternatives to the patient's existing partners.
Olivia's investigation required the same meticulous attention to detail she would bring to any major story, but with the added challenge of investigating her own trauma while maintaining journalistic objectivity. She had to separate her personal experience from her professional analysis, ensuring that her reporting met the highest standards of accuracy and fairness. Working with Chicago Magazine, she assembled a team of editors, fact-checkers, and legal advisors who treated her story with appropriate gravity. The magazine's attorneys spent 3 weeks verifying every claim, cross-referencing every source, and consulting with ethics experts to ensure they could support all allegations against Dr. Whitmore. The documentation was extensive. Phone records showing the frequency and timing of Marcus's calls to Sarah, therapy notes that revealed the gradual erosion of Olivia's self-confidence, expert testimony about the psychological techniques used to manipulate victims' perceptions, and testimonies from 7 different women who had experienced similar abuse. What made this story so legally solid, explained the magazine's fact-checker, was the consistency across all cases. Same methodology, same language patterns in therapy notes, same coaching techniques used on the victim's partners. The pattern made it impossible to dismiss as coincidental or misunderstood professional behavior. When the Chicago Magazine article was published, it struck a nerve that reverberated far beyond Chicago. The story was shared thousands of times on social media, picked up by national news outlets, and generated hundreds of comments from readers sharing their own experiences with therapeutic misconduct. The response revealed that therapeutic abuse was far more common than most people realized, but that victims had lacked the language and framework to understand their experiences or have them believed by others. Olivia's detailed documentation provided validation for experiences that many people had struggled to articulate or have believed. The Illinois Licensing Board conducted a formal hearing based on the magazine's investigation. After 4 hours of testimony and 2 hours of deliberation, they permanently revoked Sarah Whitmore's license to practice psychology. The decision was unanimous. The evidence shows a systematic pattern of professional misconduct that violated multiple ethical standards and caused severe psychological harm to vulnerable patients, the board chairman announced. Dr. Whitmore exploited therapeutic relationships for personal gain and used confidential patient information to manipulate and control intimate relationships across multiple states. But the impact extended far beyond one corrupt therapist's downfall. The investigation had exposed systematic failures in professional oversight, inadequate training about therapeutic boundaries, and the vulnerability of patients seeking mental health treatment. The ripple effects of Olivia's investigation continued to expand over the following years. Several universities added courses on therapeutic boundaries and ethical decision-making to their psychology and social work programs. State licensing boards strengthened their oversight procedures and expanded their definitions of professional misconduct.
and mental health professional organizations developed new guidelines for managing dual relationships and protecting patient confidentiality. Perhaps most importantly, victims of therapeutic abuse found their voices. Support groups formed across the country, attorneys began taking on cases that previously would have been dismissed, and mental health professionals were held to higher standards of accountability. Olivia had become an inadvertent advocate for therapeutic abuse survivors, her investigation providing validation and language for experiences that many people had struggled to articulate or have believed by others. She established herself as a leading voice on the issue, writing follow-up articles for national publications and consulting on policy changes with regulatory agencies. The story didn't end with professional sanctions. Further investigation revealed that Sarah had been criminally defrauding insurance companies by billing for couples therapy sessions that were actually individual consultations with patients' partners, and that she had used confidential patient information to manipulate multiple relationships for financial and personal gain across multiple states.
Sarah Whitmore was eventually charged with fraud and conspiracy in federal court. The evidence was overwhelming, and she served 3 years in federal prison. But more than the criminal conviction, it was the public exposure of her systematic abuse that created lasting change in how therapeutic misconduct was understood and addressed. For Olivia, the investigation represented more than professional achievement. It was a journey from victim to advocate, from powerlessness to purpose. She had transformed her worst experience into work that protected other vulnerable people, establishing a methodology for investigating systematic professional abuse that other journalists could follow. The Sarah Whitmore story taught me that personal experience can be a strength in investigative reporting, not a liability, Olivia later explained to journalism students. But it also taught me that personal investment in a story requires extra vigilance about objectivity, documentation, and professional standards. Her work earned recognition from the National Association for Mental Health Journalists and led to a career specializing in healthcare and professional misconduct investigations. She became a senior investigative editor at the Chicago Tribune, mentoring other journalists in the techniques she had developed for exposing systematic abuse. The investigation revealed uncomfortable truths about power dynamics in therapeutic relationships and the vulnerability of people seeking mental health treatment. It showed how predators could exploit professional positions to manipulate vulnerable individuals and how institutional failures enabled such abuse to continue unchecked. But it also demonstrated the power of careful journalism to create accountability and change. By documenting patterns rather than isolated incidents, by protecting sources while building airtight cases, and by translating personal experience into systematic analysis, investigative reporting could expose abuse and create lasting reforms. Systematic abuse requires systematic investigation, Olivia learned. Individual cases of misconduct are tragic, but patterns of misconduct represent institutional failures that demand comprehensive reform. 20 years after the original investigation, the impact continues to reverberate through mental health care and professional accountability systems. Therapeutic abuse cases are now reported and investigated more frequently. Professional training programs include more comprehensive ethics education, and victim support services are more widely available. The investigation established a framework for understanding and addressing therapeutic abuse that has protected countless potential victims from similar predators. It changed how journalists investigate professional misconduct, how regulatory agencies oversee mental health professionals, and how potential victims recognize warning signs of abuse. Most importantly, it gave victims permission to trust their instincts and speak out against abuse, even when the perpetrators were trusted professionals with impressive credentials. The story became a template for transforming personal trauma into social change, showing how individual experiences of abuse could be documented and analyzed to create systematic reforms. Olivia's work didn't end with the Sarah Whitmore case. She went on to investigate corruption in nursing homes, fraud in addiction treatment centers, abuse in religious counseling programs, and misconduct in various other professional contexts. But the principles she established in that first investigation continued to guide her work: meticulous documentation,
systematic pattern analysis, protection of vulnerable sources, and transformation of individual experiences into larger narratives about institutional accountability. Her career became a testament to the possibility of healing through purpose, of transforming victimization into advocacy, and of using professional skills to protect others from similar harm. She learned to trust her instincts again, to form relationships without paranoia,
without losing her sense of self, and to distinguish between healthy vulnerability and exploitation. The Sarah Whitmore investigation wasn't really about one corrupt therapist. It was about the power of truth-telling, the importance of institutional accountability, and the possibility of transforming personal trauma into social change. Every victim who finds the courage to speak out, every journalist who chooses difficult stories over easy ones, and every professional who maintains ethical standards under pressure contributes to a larger system of accountability that protects the most vulnerable among us. The work continues today. Other predators operate within professional systems. Other victims need advocates, and other institutions require scrutiny and reform. But the foundation has been established, a framework for understanding and addressing systematic abuse that will protect vulnerable people for generations to come. This story lives on in every victim who finds the courage to speak out, every professional who chooses ethics over expediency, every journalist who investigates difficult truths, and every institution that chooses accountability over protecting its own interests. Subscribe to Truth Seekers Journal, where silence is never forgotten and every story has the power to transform lives and institutions. Join our community of readers who believe that accountability journalism makes a difference and that the most important stories are often the most difficult ones to tell. Because when we shine light on systematic abuse, we protect countless others who might otherwise suffer in silence. Subscribe today and be part of the movement for transparency, accountability, and justice.